Hello everybody, this video is going to be Deep Richard the Fourth Law. If I can be as ostentatious as to call these videos part of my work, my oeuvre, this is going to be at the very centre of it all. So it may be a bit longer because it's quite complex, but it's one of these where you might want to sit down, have a cup of tea, put your headphones in, go for a walk, because I think this is really going to get to the core of what I believe is vital for the West, why tradition is so central. And it comes off the back of a very good comment from a Substack subscriber who viewed my channel on my video on the sister channel, why Christianity, maybe I should say modern Christianity, can seem so lame to many men who approach it. It feels very soft. It feels it doesn't really address some of the key themes of life for many. And even when you go there, a lot of the people seem very sweet, but a bit sheltered, to be blunt. Now, it's not like that in every single church, I accept. But it can often feel like, how is this going to really speak to the issues we face of the age, especially for men? I think men are very much drawn to the big stories of death and rebirth and dealing with pain and responsibility and all these very key vital energies that if we don't have answers to, we get quite unwell. And in response to this, I said, or in response to me saying, sometimes for those of us on the true path, we even have to let go of our understanding of the church and Christianity, even everything outside of that, to just purely seek wisdom and trust that that wisdom is going to take us back where we need to go. And in response to this, someone said, he agrees, but thinks it raises a question of how Christianity can actually hold a people together, if it even should. He says for a community to exist, we need the common unity. And if that isn't Christianity, then there would seem to be something higher that binds a community like a nation. But he struggles to see how something like a nation can really bind differing religions together, as religions make claims they're always going to be above a nation, even a pan-European nation. So it seems as a paradox, Christianity can't be the binding glue of a nation without collapsing into dogma and gutting the spiritual truth. But if there is anything placed in a higher place than God, it would seem to be an idol and effectively banish religion. And it would be susceptible to forces of a higher unity than a nation like Islam. Now, anyway, I think the best way for me to answer this question, which is very deep, is to explain what a tradition is from the top. So you have a very, very clear idea. And as I've said many times, and some people struggle with this and like to push back on it, but I keep holding to this line, tradition isn't an idea. It's not an idea amongst other ideas. If we're thinking like that, we're still in the frame of liberal modernity. Tradition isn't just a logical set of rules, or a philosophy that someone's thought through intellectually. It's more a comprehensive structure tested throughout the fires of the centuries, embodying the different elements of a given people. So, of course, there's historical elements to it. There is, of course, the intellectual tradition within it. There's the ethnic idiosyncrasies of a given people, which infuse it with a certain flavour. There's a philosophy of that people as well, and maybe even the inherited philosophies. And, of course, the spiritual experiences, and arguably even the spiritual event which began the tradition itself, the catalyst. And again, as you can imagine, in the Western world, that could be someone like Christ and the story of Christ, but many different cultures and traditions have taken that on board. So it's almost like a tree that goes outwards. Now, we've forgotten all of this in the era of modernity, of, quote, science. It's not really science. What it really is the era of the mind and the era of materialism. And I say this because, I don't want to make an idea here that I'm somehow anti-science. That's not what it is. I'm very pro-science, but science, we need to see it as a tool of our tradition, not as a god in and of itself, which we can look to guide us. You hear that a lot in this day and age, especially from the sort of right-on liberal types. Trust the science. I believe in the science. That's who I am. Well, that's fine, if you're figuring things out about the physical world. But when it comes to the metaphysical matters of life, science isn't really going to help you, which is, where the new atheism comes from. Well, we don't need anything else other than the science because all we have is the mind and the material. Now, by its nature, there's a highly authoritarian dimension to that because, if you like, it's narrowing the vast expanse of human experience purely down to the material. Roger Scruton beautifully put this into a neat phrase, which is brain scans can't teach us about love. It's a wonderful phrase. Of course, what he's saying there is, you need the artist, you need the philosopher, you need the priest for a truly cohesive and whole culture. You can't just have a test tube and a lab coat and a magnifying glass. They're wonderful things, don't get me wrong, but they're only one dimension of the civilization and the tradition. You could even say as well, I think one thing we're seeing, which is very popular among young men today, is physical disciplines. Lots of men getting into the gym, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, sports of some type. I took my son swimming actually, and it's at a weekend, and I noticed the dads go at the weekend, and I was thinking every bloke here is in good shape, including me, if you don't mind me saying so. But I was thinking we're all in good shape, it says we all work out. And I was thinking this is a very much a symptom of modernity. And I think men do it because it's one of the few places where you can express something, non-intellectual, where you can really, there's almost a spiritual element to working out. I'm not going to get too into that now, but there is something a bit beyond yourself. There is a self-letting go that can occur. Of course, I understand that can backfire when people start spray painting themselves orange and all that. But I always remember David Goggins, who is this machine of a man who goes and runs 100-mile marathons with broken ankles and stuff. I'm not necessarily pro his message, but he did say something really interesting once about how he didn't trust the experts with their pot bellies and bowling heads in the university rooms telling him what the body's capable of. He wants to go and do it. And there's a really admirable energy in there, something about, wanting to experience life for yourself rather than rely on sort of data sets. And again, it's almost a rebellion against modernity. But the point I'm making here is, we have been narrowed down in modernity into the mind. And this is why so many men are suffering with mental health issues. You're supposed to be in your body, your spirit, you're a whole person, not just a mind. But we think we're this little captain in our brain. We think we are our brain. And we sort of steer ourselves around in these meat bodies. It's the same thing as Homo economicus. If you don't know what that is, it's, the modern man is drilled down or boiled down, reduced down to his economic value and what he can produce in the world. And, I think it's clear I have a bit of a hippie socialist side to me in some senses, but I have to be careful of that. I understand a man has to work hard. I understand it's good to earn money. I understand it's important to try and be financially free. But as someone who's drawn to the more aesthetic side of life, ideas, philosophy, I've never quite liked this idea that we all need to turn into entrepreneurs and salesmen, and in a way you kind of have to be like that to succeed in this day and age. It's because of the era we're in, and if you can't do that very often, you'll work for someone who has done that, as a wage slave, basically. So my point here is that to understand tradition, we have to get outside of how we think about the world in this day and age. And as I say, a good way to start with that is to go right back to the beginning of the tradition. Now, I'm using the Western tradition here, pardon me, because we all understand it, but you can apply this to any tradition. It always starts with a supernatural event. Now, you can view that as a literal supernatural event, like, Jesus, the rock moves away, and he's no longer there, and he's ascended into heaven. You can view that as literal or symbolic, but normally what you'll find is there is some sort of message in there which normally harks back to a sort of non-dual, esoteric, transcendental truth that gives us almost a reason for being prior to what we had before. In the Christian tradition, you could say that's something like the Logos and love, and arguably you could say they're the same thing, but they're certainly split into two distinct paths in the West, or the Western tradition. The Logos is very much reason, finding that line in life that you can align to some sort of truth. There's obviously an objective version of that, which the sciences have moved towards. But I think there's an internal, spiritual, moral side to it, which we're all aware of, consciously or unconsciously. We know when we've done something wrong. And love, as well, as I say, that would be the idea of something like Christ saying that, the highest order is to love God and love your neighbour. Now, again, that's quite misunderstood in this day and age. People think it sort of means you have to be apologetic and meek to your neighbour or anyone else, basically. That's not it. It's more recognising the shared being. You're animated by the same transcendental force. Let's not get too bogged down in this. The point is that you have this great explosion at the beginning of a tradition which sets it off. Then over the centuries, you add in the historical elements, the battles won and lost, and what that does to a people, the intellectual tradition and which way that goes. As I say, I believe the intellectual tradition is influenced as well by the ethnic idiosyncrasies. You see this when you read a lot of the traditionalist thinkers. They'll even explore how different civilizations think about time in different ways, or they think about mathematics in different ways and so on. Or even think about, what life is for in different ways, which is, of course, going to impact the focus of your intellectual tradition, which in turn, creates a differing philosophy, or sometimes philosophies within a broader philosophy, and so on and so on. Then you throw in on top of that the spiritual experiences of the given individuals as part of a tradition down the line. So, in the West, we could say John Milton, William Blake, in England, of course, I'm focusing on here, English visions about good and evil and transcendent meaning, the great mystics and where they point us towards. All of this boils into, or is pushed into, the broader understanding of what the tradition is and becomes. And I think you can probably see where I'm going with this, in that no one is going to understand the tradition in all its depth. This is where the great saying comes from. If you remove a brick of tradition, you're going to find out what it's for. Sometimes it might be meaningless. Maybe you were right to remove that brick. You can replace it with something better. Other times you better be damn careful, because you could be ripping down a wall that's stopping hell from coming out. I think we've ripped down many sacred bricks in our tradition in the Western world now, and we're now paying the price in myriad different ways. But the point is that I'm getting here is that there are levels of understanding, and not all of us are going to grasp the tradition because it's bigger than each of us. It's sort of a story which was there long before we were around and will be there long after. That's why, at least in the more conservative understanding, one of the most sacred duties in life is to try and maintain that tradition, religious or not, to do your little bit in maintaining it, whether it's philosophically, religiously, spiritually, culturally. We can all do our bit. And of course, as I say, the levels of understanding are going to apply to different people within the tradition, and even the dimensions of the tradition are going to appeal to different people within the tradition. So again, this is something that we struggle with in this era, because we're in the era of liberal modernity, of mass democracy. So we almost think, well, everybody can understand it, but they just can't. A key element of the traditional worldview is that hierarchy is natural. And there are some extremists, quote unquote, in that regard, like Evola. He was a proud aristocrat, really did fundamentally believe that hierarchy was absolutely central and it should be very fixed. But he also said, along that hierarchy, there are different classes, the priestly class, the warrior class, and so on. The priestly class is normally very close to the top. And you have different lines on it, but generally I think that's true. There is a hierarchy in life. And I think if you look at the world honestly, in my belief, you will find that's the case. Some people just aren't interested in the higher transcendent aspects of life. And the argument, even I think Plato made this argument, if you have mass democracy, what that does, it doesn't enhance the society. In fact, it brings everybody right back down to the lowest common denominator. Controversial take in this day and age, but I personally think there might be something to it. But it's also why we can't understand that these ideas, these transcendent ideas, are only ever have appealed to a small minority. And this is a very key thing for me to say about the sister channel. I'm fully aware that this isn't going to appeal to everyone, and that's absolutely fine. The people that are going to go there, the people that want to figure out this esoteric knowledge, normally it comes from a calling from within. I know I had that calling from a very young age. I could feel this almost golden energy inside of me whenever anything came up in that regard. And it took me years to kind of figure out what it was. But it's almost like, what does Plato call it? Is it eudaimonia, something like that? It's your natural calling in life. Or was it Aristotle? I forget which. But anyway, it's this idea of your natural calling which brings forth the truth in you. So we have to remember, the idea is in the traditional understanding that the religion, the spiritual belief, really is in the remit of the priestly class. And they will have a way of understanding scripture, society, the interaction between the transcendent and down into the earthly, that the average person just cannot. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't get the odd lay theologian, who might be, have a high natural aptitude for this. These people do exist, and they've done some wonderful works in the history of the Western tradition. But historically, the idea was the elders. And the elders almost interpret what the message of love really is. That's why I've said on the channel many times, we often think about something like marriage, or the way I grew up thinking about marriage was, it's just this, it's a contract of the state. You're just being forced by the state to wed with someone. What's the point? Just be free and have sex and have fun. It's very much the ethos of the era I grew up in. But as I started to kind of learn more about the spiritual side of things and the religious side of things and the traditional side of things, I started to realize, well, hang on, if we all act like Andrew Tate and try and get the money and the women, clearly that's going to lead to a situation where some guys are getting laid all the time and they get, 80% of the women, and the most of the guys aren't. And this is exactly what's happened. So this isn't a loving worldview at all. What, in my view, I think the religions are correct. You need to kind of have this idea of overcoming your own lust, realizing there's something bigger to life, and then committing in a marriage which creates this harmony for you in your own personal life, but also the society at large. Because roughly speaking, it balances man and woman out evenly and avoids this absolute cacophony of mess we've got now in the West with the dating market, where women just always want, the 6-foot guy with 6 figures and a 6-pack. And of course that guy will happily pump and dump them, but it's very hard to get a guy like that, and it's just created an absolute mess. And that's basically unsolvable now until a breakdown and breakthrough in my eyes. But the point is, you start to realise the wisdom of the tradition, and you can see, okay, the elders in the church expressed it very badly. The church has been corrupted anyway. But the point is, there was a loving instinct in there somewhere. It did have a divine wisdom, which we've lost touch with. So the point is that at one time, we would have had these guides passing these things down the hierarchy, which keeps us all ordered and combined within the unity, you could say. Of course, now, as I say, the church has been corrupted, so really a lot of the bishops and the vicars and the priests, they just serve liberalism. That's all they do. That's all they're there for. The power structure has been corrupted and taken over by an alien force. But we must remember that these understandings aren't ever going to appeal to the masses. They might have an instinct as to why they're right, but the real esoteric teachings of love and how this is transcendent really need to come down from those that are called to that journey. And that's where the dogma comes from. In the question, the fella mentioned dogma. Well, we always view dogma as a bad thing, but dogma is actually necessary on one level of understanding. Because if we think about, I mentioned in a video earlier, the village church. And the idea is you have transcendent love, and this is understood, if you like, by the great priestly class, and they pass it down into the tradition, and then that's fed into the local bishops, which goes into the local vicars, and then it almost creates the norm that we live by as a community, that creates the moral structure, and all we have to do is abide by that in our own life. Now, if the moral structure is true, abiding with it will feel true. So it's a wonderful structure, right from the very top right down to the individual. And of course, this is a fundamental part of Anglo life. It was the idea of if we're all rooted in the shared morality and we can trust each other to have high fidelity to that morality, you create a high trust society. It's also why multiculturalism and mass immigration is key in destroying that. I think those of us who believe foul play has gone on would argue that that's why they've pushed it. It's destroyed the underlying structure of the Western tradition, knowingly or unknowingly. I've actually been watching a few clips from the comedy show King of the Hill recently. It's a great show. And if you don't know, the character's sort of this very conservative Texan guy. He's very lovable, called Hank. But his whole life is rooted around high fidelity to good conservative values, like working hard, taking responsibility. And yeah, he's a bit blind and foolish when it comes to the modern world and a bit closed. But in principle, he's lovable because he's honourable. He has high fidelity to the order. And very often the episodes make very clever commentary on about how Hank often looks stupid. But at the end of the episode, he very often gets proved right because of his honour. There's a higher value in there somewhere for Hank. And again, that's very Anglo. It's not a mistake. His name is Hank Hill, Hill being an Anglo name, of course. But anyway, the point I'm getting at here is what we're talking to is something greater than the material, the scientific. It's why even Dawkins, himself said not too long back that he's sorry to see Christian culture disappearing, even though, he's been in the very forefront of that charge with a great swinging sword, destroying it. But you can understand, when we understand how tradition works, why he's saying that. It's because tradition is actually bigger than Christianity alone. It's bigger than our belief or lack thereof in a transcendent deity. It takes in philosophy and history and people and culture and ethnos. I'm sure Dawkins won't go that far, but it does, whether he likes it or not. So when we start to understand the Western tradition this way, and again, I am focusing on the West here because we can understand it. We can do this with other traditions. You do find that there is really, I think the Western tradition is that meeting point between Greece and Rome. Greece being philosophy, obviously, especially Plato, Aristotle too, and the meeting point of Rome, which is obviously Christianity. But with it, I think there is something about the Roman warrior spirit in there too, but perhaps the codifying as well, the dogmatic codifying of the Christian structure which underpinned the West. But you cannot remove the European spirit from that. This is why I think it's quite risky what some people are trying to do today of just, we'll take these ideas of Western culture and just apply them in Iraq. All the people coming here from Iraq or Somalia can just buy into our Greco-Roman ideas, and they'll be just like us. They won't, because they don't have the European spirit. And I'm aware there are always outliers who do integrate and can. I'm not saying no one can. But broadly speaking, it's not going to work. And this is where we come to the key aspect of this around nation. And I think this is where the debate really happens today, because there is this issue of do we move towards the transcendent tradition, where we get vitality from? Or do we go to the nation and defend the nation, even arguably the continent now? And of course, I would say on a lower level of understanding, it's obvious to go to the nation and the continent, because you think, well, this is what's here now. Enough of your, silly, fancy pants, woo-woo ideas. We haven't got time for that. What we need is the nation to defend. And in one sense, they are right. Well, in more than one sense, many senses they're right. It does matter. The geographical landmass matters, But we have to understand that the tradition is much bigger than the nation, and it doesn't deny the nation either. And as I've said many times on the channel, sorry, I just had to have a break in the video there. My son was crying downstairs. I had to go and help my wife out. But anyway, the point I was getting to, what I've said many times on the channel is this idea that, let's say everything happens, we have this remigration, mass deportations, Well, we're still in the same consciousness we were before when this mess started. We need something to happen to bring us back to the vitality which sustained us to build Western culture in the first place. That's the real symptom. So yeah, the political issues are all incredibly important, but they're symptomatic of the real fall which has happened within, which is, again, this focus down on the mind, the material, over the heart and the soul, the non-rational elements of life. And again, I think properly understood, it's hierarchical as well. You need the transcendent message, God, you could say. Then you need how that melts into the tradition and the wise class. That melts down into the nation, which melts into the tradition, and then the community and the family. Now, at the moment, I think that the whole of Europe or the whole of the West should be joining together in the shared battle for our tradition and, by extension, our nations. That's how we save ourselves, not by focusing on nation alone. But you can see, as again the fellow asking the question asked, nation is becoming an idol now. And you get this with some of the more angry commenters that I'll see, both on my channel and online on Twitter and places like that as well, where the nation has really become an idol for them. That's the risk of nationalism. Not that nationalism is wrong per se, but again, there are higher levels above it, and we can't get stuck on that layer because we'll just fall back to the material world and get eaten alive in a world of ideology. It's interesting, actually, because you notice this with some of the nationalist types. They will come on this channel and say things like, you enjoy worshipping a dead Jew, you moron, and all this sort of stuff. And in one sense, I understand their concern, that they're worried that this kind of ethnic betrayal that's going on and all that sort of stuff. But I don't think they've really understood what Christ has said. I'm not going to take that as an insult, and Christ certainly wouldn't. He'd forgive you, because when you make statements like that, it's a very clear indication that you really don't know what you're doing. Like Christ said on the cross, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. Because what Christ was talking to was beyond the ethnic layer. And I am in no means denying the ethnic layer. I think it's an appalling thing that modernity has denied it. It makes out that it's somehow noble. It's not. It's evil, really. But the reality of life is beyond the ethnic layer. It really is. And that's where the vitality streams through from. It's from the spirit, which is beyond all form. The non-dual truth. That's love, if you like. And that courses into the world like Christ did. And once we lose touch with that, we lose touch with our own poise. We'll simply be in a world of war, and you'll never win. Even if you win the war, you'll lose the next one. There will be no overcoming. We will not maintain our tradition that way. It will collapse. So again, the point that I'm getting at here is you can see what's happened in modernity. Because we've removed that traditional transcendent layer, we're now trying to replicate it via forced materialist ideologies. Equality in the physical dimension is the obvious one. Communism obviously tried to do that explicitly, but liberalism is the same. The idea of the blank slate. Because we've denied, if you like, the transcendent force where we can find oneness, true oneness, amongst man or being, whatever. It all comes back to the one. We have to try and enforce it externally, which creates hell on earth. What we need is the traditional model. It's the only way through. Now, again, of course, the biblical tradition doesn't deny nations or hierarchy anyway. But the point that I'm trying to get at here is for us to truly be able to understand the tradition, we have to, let's just say, take the image of Christ, whether you view Christ as God or just an avatar of wisdom or non-dual truth. We have to understand that he never speaks in political particulars. He speaks in transcendent principles. This is why you can't boil that Christ down to being a socialist like liberals try to do. Or even heard this Baptist minister in America once say, Jesus was a pro-gun capitalist. That's not who Christ is. He's bigger than politics. What he is there to do, what his teaching is there for the priestly class and us too in our individual way to reflect on and say, well, are my political and personal wants coming from somewhere true? Are they rooted in love? And remember, love isn't smoochy-woochy, that's Hollywood. Or feminine, that's more modern liberalism. It's truth, it's justice, it's compassion on the one side, but order on the other. Can I really open my heart to the cross and say, this is true? Now, we might not be right, but you can certainly ask if it's coming from a true place in your heart. And if you align with that, and if we can align with that, as a people and a culture, we will get through whatever faces us. We will get through it, because we'll be pure. And you'll be able to get through the chaos of the world. And you won't get lost in fear and anger and resentment and desire for revenge. Justice can be implemented where it needs to, but we won't get lost. But again, this is the idea of why this priestly class has really been destroyed. Because basically at the moment, the Western people are a great liner without a shipmaster, without a captain. We just don't know where we're going. We're in the dark, we're being pulled in every direction, and we're going to crash into the rocks, but perhaps we need to now. And then all of this comes together, and this is why men have been destroyed as well. If you destroy the men, you destroy the hierarchy, you destroy the masculine principle of justice, boundaries, order in the world. All you're left with is the feminine pole, which is freedom on one side, but chaos is its dark side. So the point is that I'm getting here is to understand the tradition. It's the divine spark. Then it goes through the centuries into the people, and then it works down, through the traditions and the institutions. And different people are going to be called to different elements of the tradition, but it takes the wise leaders to guide us through. But we've destroyed those wise leaders. So the point is now, and a key point of what I'm saying on the channel, is it's time in my mind for a new European tradition. Now, when I say new, I don't mean we get rid of Christianity. That's not what I'm saying. It's really the new old tradition. It's, if you like, it's the ancient truths reawakened in a new way, in a new era. And I think this is why many people go to church and they're like, I'm just not finding what I'm looking for here. I know there's something essential I'm looking for, but it's not speaking to me. Because again, it's most likely to be some milquetoast, middle of the road guy who, votes Lib Dem and watches Premier League football, and he's a nice guy. But this isn't death and rebirth and reawakening in a new era for the West. That will eventually come. It has to come. But it depends upon us understanding the depth of this tradition, which isn't science versus spirituality. It's spirituality, science, nation, all in one cohesive hierarchy. You could argue the best attempt at this, I think Jung said this, has been the Catholic Church. And I think they've definitely made the best effort at it. But even now you could argue the Catholic Church is being heavily impacted by liberalism. I think liberalism's on the inside now of the Catholic Church. Do feel free to disagree with me in the comments, but it seems to me that it's in trouble. But the point I'm making here is, for us to really survive, this has to come to a new tomorrow. A new tradition for the new era, for new people, and it will come from, again, a spiritual reawakening that will hold us together and give us the poise and vitality that we need to essentially take back the Western tradition, Western culture, which is ours anyway, and by virtue of that, we will re-enchant our nations. And there will be elements of that, again, that will be highly political, highly material. But without this core dimension, we will be very, very lost. So I hope some of this made sense. A heavy video, I know, but this is at the very core of what it means, basically, to be a traditionalist and how you see the world. Do let me know your thoughts below. Of course, do join the sister channel, The Sacred Way, all about personal and spiritual transformation. Join the Substack too. Exclusive content and to connect with me, the monthly calls. And subscribe to this channel as well. Enjoy the rest of your day.